And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and sports fans, and in fact, just people of conscience everywhere, I think have been following with great interest the stories of the NFL and concussion research, and those stories got even worse recently with the news that the NFL had been trying to influence research into concussion. And here to tell us a little bit more about that story so that we can talk through it together is Lindsay is a sports reporter with Progress. She has also written for a number of other publications, including Vice Sports, USA Today, Tennis Magazine, Tennis.com, and a whole bunch of others. So, Lindsay, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. And listen, not a pretty story, but tell us a little bit. Just give us first a big overview on the NFL and concussion research, what we learned recently.
So what happened is in 2012, as the league everyone was getting a lot more aware about the long-term brain damage that playing in the NFL could bring, and the NFL donated $30 million to the National Institute of Health for concussion research. And these funds were earmarked for concussion research. They're not completely unrestricted in the breadth of what they could, focus on, but they were supposed to be unrestricted as far as the NFL would have no influence over, who got those grants, that the National Institute of Health would make all of those decisions. But what we're finding out now is that in 2015, I guess these grant processes take quite some time, the National Institute of Health selected a researcher from Boston University to get $16 million of this grant money to go toward the study. And this is the person leading this story, whose name I'm looking up because I'm just blanking on completely right now. But anyways, he has been very critical of the NFL in the past. He is really Dr. Robert Stern. He has spoken up a lot about the NFL's concussion settlement lawsuits, about how they've been having a very narrow definition of what type of players and what type of who should be getting help, of who should be getting assistance from the NFL. And they really didn't want him to get this money that they had earmarked, that they had donated to the National Institute of Health. So they started interfering with this and essentially interfered to the point that the National Institute of Health took away their money from the study. They took their money back and ended up funding this study through Dr. Robert Stern with taxpayer money.
Let me just pause for a second. Then. So we had all this controversy going back a couple of years now on concussions, and the NFL got good public relations, I think, when they agreed to kick in $30 million to study concussion research. Although to them, $30 million isn't much, I would argue. Right. But they said it was unrestricted, but then they blocked it from going to this doctor who had criticized them. They wanted to, according to your summary, among others, they wanted it to go to doctors that had cozy relationships with the NFL, and wound up we had to spend taxpayer money instead, right?
Right. I mean, that's the big takeaway here. They claim they want the science. They claim they want the research. They claim they're going to follow the science and listen to the scientists and listen to the researchers. But it's clear that they want to hear what they want to hear.
Yeah, and just to help people understand what we're really talking about, when we talk about concussions in the NFL, this is not something that occasionally happens to a football player, right?
No. This is, what these studies are about are really about CTE, which is it's a degenerative brain disorder. And this is what you're hearing in the news a lot. I feel like every few weeks there's a new football player, and it happens in other sports. There was just a BMX rider who committed suicide whose brain was found to have CTE. And what CTE is it's a little bit different than just your regular concussion, because it's these subconcussive hits that lead to CTE, which means it's all the little hits you take throughout a football game. It's
Right.
all those little hits add up to really do some long-term brain damage. And that's really what they're trying to study now with this money, because this is what is really leading to the dementia, to the player suicide, to the mood swings, to a really incredibly decreased quality of life. This isn't a like your knee goes out and you have to limp around for the rest of your life. This is changing who you are as a person, because it's changing the brain. And that's what they're trying to study, because right now CTE can only be diagnosed once you've deceased. So they can't diagnose CTE in living people. And that's what this study, the Dr. Robert Stern study, was supposed to be focused on, or is focused on, I guess, is trying to figure out how we can diagnose this in living people, so we can, then figure out how to treat it.
Yeah, because I think, and I think this speaks to the research, but it also speaks to just how horrible human beings, Goodell and the NFL are, in my opinion. Anyway, is the fact that in the autopsies or in the post-death analyses of players' brains, I think it was you had the figure in your piece, but I think it was 96% of NFL players had this. Is that right?
And now that is, you have to put that in context. So these are brains that were donated to the Boston Brain Bank, where their families had already suspected that they might have.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
So it's not, but it's still very significant. That's a very, very significant number. And there have been a lot of new studies lately, and studies that I found fascinating. Like recently, a brain bank in Florida did a study, and these weren't on people who donated their brains. These were people whose brains had been donated for a lot of Alzheimer's research.
Uh-huh.
And they started researching and figuring out who had been not a professional athlete, but who had played an amateur athlete, And they were able to study and found that even 30% of just amateur athletes who had played contact sports like football and rugby, and predominantly football, that 30% of those brains had CTE, whereas 0% of the brains that they studied who hadn't played contact sports had CTE. So those studies, too, are adding a lot of clarity into how different the rates of CTE are in football players versus you or I, writers and people in regular, non-contact professions.
Yeah, and I think this is really important. I think that the fact that the NFL sought to skew this research, it really bothers me. We're talking with Lindsay Gibbs, sports writer for Think Progress, among others. Lindsay, do you know anything about these doctors who were considered friendlier with the NFL? Do you know who those guys are, or is that something you didn't get into in your own writing about this?
Well, so I do know that they're members of a lot of them are members of the Head, Neck, and Spine Committee, which is the committee that the NFL has that's dedicated to studying injuries of the head, neck, and spine. So these are doctors that have pretty direct affiliation with the NFL, and through this affiliation are getting free Super Bowl tickets, or getting their travel paid for. They're not necessarily all full-time employees of the NFL, but they're on this prestigious committee that is influencing the NFL. And a lot of these are, once they decided that Robert Stern wasn't going to receive their funding, these are the people who were applying for the funding. And that's a pretty obvious conflict of interest. And it harkens back to the NFL's original mild traumatic brain injury committee that it started back in the 90s, which was led by a rheumatologist. And I don't know if anyone who's listening, if you saw the movie Concussion, the Will Smith movie Concussion, but that was explored there. So in 2010, that committee shut down once it was realized how poorly run that committee was, that they were trying to really promote junk science and really, just completely minimize the effect of concussions. And this head, neck, and spine committee was supposed to be the fixed version of this, the good version of this. And now you're seeing that they're applying for these grants. So it's just really disturbing all around.
Yeah, it feels like they kept their thumb on the scale throughout this whole thing with the well-being and lives and brains of their own players at risk. It just I'm just shocked. I mean, I'm not shocked in the sense of surprise, to be honest with you, but it's shocked in the sense of just how vile it seems to me that I'm sorry to use such strong language, but it just seems to me like really bad behavior on the NFL's part once again. And the investigation by the Democratic staff in the House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, as you reported, said the league, quote, acted improperly in attempting to influence the outcome. So do you know, Lindsay, what happens next in terms of going forward with research on this CTE condition in football players?
I know that the Boston University is continuing to do great work, but this isn't going to stop the work of a guy like Dr. Robert Stern or the Brain Bank or the Department of Veteran Affairs, which has been doing just some fantastic work. So the research is moving forward. Obviously, the NFL's money could help that move along faster. The NFL has a lot of funds. But the more awareness that is gained about this, the easier it's going to be to establish. And the NFL is not going to be able to stop this research from happening. And, the good news is what's happening now is younger players, these conversations are happening. They're getting mainstream attention. Younger players are starting to take their health into their own hands. You're having players retire earlier. You're having players going to the Players Council and asking for the players, their Players Association to really tell them what's going on here. You're having players take themselves out of games, not come back as quickly. And all of these I'm someone who loves football, who understands how troublesome the game is, and who wants to see if there's a way that this game can be played without, without this horrible problem existing to the extent it does now. And all of these are good signs. It's very frustrating that the NFL isn't doing what it should be doing, isn't taking the steps it should be taking. And I don't know how you keep that in check. But the good news is the scientific community is pushing forward, and that there are reporters and scientists who are going to get this information out there and hopefully to a place where the players can empower themselves with the knowledge.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think about this, Lindsay, in terms of as a fan too. I mean, since you're a football fan, I mean, should we feel guilty about watching football now, you think?
I mean, I do, and like
I do too.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it, but every time, there's a hit, I wince, and I write about this. I write a lot about concussions, and I write a lot about the research, and as a reporter, I think, well, the only thing I can do that'll make me feel better is to keep highlighting, what the NFL is doing wrong and what other people are doing right, what other options are out there. And there's, I went this over the winter, I guess in February, I went and watched, there's a helmetless and padless kind of football league that's taking place on the grassroots level. That's supposedly figured out a way to reduce concussions, because once you take away this armor, the players aren't being as reckless out there with their bodies and with their heads, which I think it's counterintuitive, but once you think about it, it really makes a lot of sense. And
I see what
that's
you mean. Yeah, I had to think about that for a second, but yeah.
Well, because you think that the helmets protect the skull, but they don't protect the brain. The brain still switches around within the skull when these hits happen. So when you have your helmet on, you feel safer than you actually are. And so that football league, which is called the A7FL, is this year collecting a lot of data. So they're putting sensors on their heads. So they're gonna collect data. We're figuring out how to get data about hits, and so that we can make games safer and we can make things better. And the knowledge is going to get out there. The thing is, the last place all this is going to get is the NFL, right? They're going to be the
No,
slowest to make any changes, but it's important to uplift this stuff that's happening in the lower levels.
yeah, I think that's a great point because I think it's important for people to understand that we're not talking necessarily about we'll never get to watch football again. We're talking about a different kind of game, not about getting rid of the game. And I think that's important for people to know too. That I think there is, and this will be our last exchange, I guess. But just so you know, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think there's probably a model, a kind of football out there that we can continue to watch that won't be exploiting and ruining its players like this.
I agree. I mean, I don't think it's never going to be the safest sport out there, right? And you're never, in any sport, you're never going to completely eliminate the risk of injury, but you want to make it as safe as possible, and you want to empower the players with knowledge. I think that's the most important thing. You don't want young kids going out there and hurting themselves because, we focus on it in the pro level so much, but this trickles down. I mean, about less than 1% of the players who are playing in high school make it to the pros, but the players playing in high school are susceptible to brain injury just as much. And so it's everything needs to change. It needs to be a completely institutional change. And luckily, there are people doing a lot of great scientific research right now that will hopefully move things in that direction.
And unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But thanks so much because this is really informative. Lindsay Gibbs, sports reporter with Think Progress. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.